All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday. I hope you guys are well. Welcome to my favorite time of the week. It is my Friday afternoon live stream, and Jose Orozco, I do my own thumbnails. Thank you very much, sir. I hope you guys are doing all right. I've noticed something recently in the charts and in the data, in the economic data, and a lot of things started to fall into place when I noticed this. Now, if you guys have been following my channel for the last few months, you've probably heard me talking a lot about deflation, about how we've already achieved disinflation in the economy. That is inflation coming down. That's disinflation. Prices still going up, but going up just barely. But in some segments of the economy, we actually do have deflation, prices going down. Things like used cars are clearly getting cheaper. Now, one of the hallmarks of deflation is a shrinking money supply. And really, for the better part of the last 8 or 9 months, that's what we've had, a shrinking money supply. The U.S. money supply year over year is shrinking for the first time since the Great Depression. Yikes. But something changed about 2 months ago. In May, the money supply ticked up just a little bit. And then the same thing happened again in June. The money supply stopped shrinking. And it had been shrinking since about April of last year. And I traded a few text messages with Joe Brown over at Heresy Financial a couple of weeks ago. We were just kind of bouncing ideas off of each other, kind of wondering where was this growth in the money supply coming from? And we never really got to an answer. We couldn't really explain where it was coming from. It sure as heck is not coming from bank credit, because banks are not lending right now. At least they're lending less. You're going to see that in some of the charts today. Bank credit is in contraction right now because since Silicon Valley and Signature Bank failed, the banks have gotten very defensive. They're very careful who they lend to because they're weary of losses. And so it's not bank credit. It's probably not the Fed, at least not on the surface, because the Fed is still engaged in quantitative tightening. They're still letting assets roll off the balance sheet as government bonds that the Federal Reserve bought mature and the government pays back the Fed those bonds. The Fed is just destroying that money to the tune of somewhere around $90 billion a month. So this expansion in the money supply is not coming from banks, and it's not coming from the Fed. Where is it coming from? Well, the answer is it is the banks and the Fed. They're not lending to us, though. They're lending to each other. The banks are bailing each other out right now. All of these unrealized losses that are sitting on the balance sheets because the bonds have gone down in value that they bought during the height of the pandemic. The banks have all these problems. A lot of these smaller banks in particular have been borrowing very expensive money from the Federal Reserve and from the Federal Home Loan Banks. Money that cost them about 5% interest to borrow. Very expensive. And this is causing these banks to very slowly but very surely go out of business because banks make money by making loans. And ideally, the interest they charge on the loans is supposed to be higher than the interest they pay on their own debt. But with this expensive borrowings that the small banks are having to do from the Fed and from the Federal Home Loan Banks, the small banks in the country are going out of business. And the chief beneficiary is none other than mega monolith JP Morgan. They are the financial blob that is ransacking town, gobbling up people, growing ever bigger every step of the way. And remember, guys, the main takeaway from the global financial crisis, besides beware a housing bubble, something that we could all stand to repeat often and loudly right now, as Zillow tells me my house is worth over $1 million. Yeah, right. But the other takeaway from the global financial crisis was that banks should not be allowed to become too big to fail. Too big to fail should mean too big to exist in the first place. If a bank becomes so big that its loss, its collapse would hurt everybody, then we need to break up that bank. It should not be allowed to get that big. It is an existential risk to the well-being of the average person because it creates a moral hazard. Now that big bank knows I could screw up as bad as I want, take all the risk in the world, and John and Jane Q taxpayer will bail my butt out every time I do it. So that creates a moral hazard where the public bears the responsibility for the losses, but the big banks get all the gains. And that is exactly where we find ourselves. And this concept of too big to fail has now become so perverted that when a small bank is declared too big to fail, Right as it fails, the government bails them out, and the mega banks come in and gobble them up and get even bigger. Well, if the small bank was too big to fail, why are you letting JP Morgan get even bigger? And that is why the money supply is expanding right now. All these loan programs that have been created to string along the little banks. We're gonna don our tinfoil hats here, folks, because we're gonna get awful they heavy today. As they string along these little banks, and they slowly go out of business, the big guys are gobbling them up little bits at a time, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is a problem for all of us. We're going to show it in the charts today. But first, I got to shrink my big melon of a head and say hi to the man, the Mish, the legend, Mr. Mod. What's going on, brother? How you doing today?
Man, I'm doing so great. It's so hot here. It's over 100 here in Lincoln today again. Ooh. And luckily, I think it breaks up tomorrow. The heat dome breaks up.
No, my heart goes out to you, Mish. In the heat, and also to Jose Orozco, who was telling me in the chat that his AC was out for a while, but I think he got it back. My AC was out for a while this week as well. We had the power go out here during the week. I lost everything, and then when power came back on, my transfer switch that automatically kicks on my standby generator, that failed. And so I lost my air conditioning, my pool pump, I lost all of my stove, my washer dryer, all the big 220 loads in my house failed. So I had to bring in an electrician. I had one day without AC this week, and it was miserable. So my heart goes out to you guys who are without power at the moment. But let's go through the markets real quick before we get into everything about they with a capital T. And when I say they, guys, I mean they, the ruling class, the elite, the big bankers, the central bankers, the people who pull the levers of power in the world, often at your expense. Right now, the CNN Fear Greed Index is at 78, still in extreme greed territory where it has been for way too long. The market remains top heavy. You've heard this before. I won't dwell on it. S&P 500 is up 44 more points today, or 0.99% at 4,581. The Dow's up 191.54%, 35,473 on the Dow. And the NASDAQ leading the way today. Look at the gains in the NASDAQ. Got back everything it lost from about 9:45 yesterday through closing, up 266 points or 1.89%, 14,315 on the NASDAQ, being driven largely by Intel earnings, which I talked about on my morning live stream this morning. Looking over at commodities, we got gold is up $12 today, 1,958 for gold. Silver, my favorite of the shinies, is up 6 cents, $24.43 an ounce for silver. Crude oil, WTI, $80.42, up another 33 cents. Oil's run continues. Platinum and palladium, the PGM metals, they're pretty much flat, down a buck, up a buck, not a big change there. And we're going to talk about wheat just because we've been watching it down $8 right now, or 1.18% for wheat futures on the lack of news coming out of the Black Sea today. The U.S. dollar is down 15 basis points this morning. That's the DXY, or the U.S. dollar index. That is at 101.62, off 15 basis points. It was way off earlier today. It clawed back some of those. And again, that's after the ripping rally that the Dixie had yesterday. The dollar is up on the week. And looking over at the bond market, we did have a slight pullback in yields after the big run that bonds had yesterday. That's to be expected. The 30-year Treasury is down 3 basis points, or 0.03%. That is at 4.02. We got the 10-year yielding 3.97, down 4 basis points. 2-year at 4.89, also down 5 basis points, and the 1 month up a basis point at 5.373. Yes,
you want to pull up the 10-year curve?
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch that. What?
10-year curve. You want to pull up the 10-year curve?
Let's bring up the 10-year curve. Long term or short term?
The 10-year?
Yes.
Oh, short term is fine.
How far back you want to go?
I wanted just the shape of the curve here recently. The channel that it's been in and the breakout.
Okay, let's show that again. Here we go. This is the U.S. 10-year Treasury. First of all, we're going to zoom out to about the beginning of 2022. So you can see the monster run the 10-year Treasury had in 2022. That's off the back of the Fed's tightening cycle. It's not one for one. The Fed doesn't directly influence the 10-year Treasury. They only influence the shorter-term rates, but it does put upward pressure on that. Now, that ended right around November when the 10-year Treasury yield entered this bull flag pattern, which is kind of a continuation pattern of the previous run. Now, we've been in that. We've failed to break above this descending level several times now. We broke above that. It was a false breakout, came back down right as this golden cross was happening with the 50-day moving average breaking above the 200-day moving average. Ever since the 50-day moving average has been support for the 10-year yield, and we are now back above that trend line. Little bit of red today, but after that big green candle yesterday, that's not surprising. The level to watch on the 10-year Treasury, though, is about 4.07. That is the level I am concerned about because that is the two previous highs that it failed to break out from March 2nd and July 7th. We break above that level, it is off to the races for the 10-year Treasury, and that would not be good things for the U.S. economy, which is hopelessly dependent on debt. All righty, let's talk about the main story. First of all, let's look at this guy here. The reason why we are donning the tinfoil hat today. We're going to get all kinds of conspiracy theory today, all right? And look, guys, it's the 2020s. Conspiracy theories are not what they once were. If you're a conspiracy theorist in 2023, it just means you've been paying attention. If you were a conspiracy theorist in 2018 or 2017, okay, you were probably a little kooky, a little nutty, all right? But let's be honest, those guys were proven right, weren't they? About a lot of stuff. Way too much stuff they were proven right about. If the powers that be, if they would stop making that true, I would sure appreciate it. But that is the reasoning behind the tinfoil hats, because tinfoil hats used to be the joke about the alien enthusiasts would put tinfoil on their heads to prevent the aliens from scanning their brainwaves. Well, now we put this on so that these jabronis in Silicon Valley who want to scan our eyeballs and give us universal basic income and redistribute our wealth as they see fit, they know that we're paying attention. So the tinfoil hat, when you see this, this is a middle finger to J.P. Morgan and Jamie Dimon. What were you going to say, Mish?
I think it's kind of funny that we learned that aliens during a congressional, and I got it, it was whistleblowers, it wasn't the actual DOD. But one, the DOD didn't deny it, and two, no one cared.
Yeah, nobody cared. I saw a great meme going around.
People's interest.
It was Lynn Alden tweeted this out. It was a meme from somebody else. I can't remember the originator, or I'd give him credit. But it was a picture of an alien. It says, "I'm here, aren't you shocked?" And the human says, "Not really. I got a lot going on right now." Like the conspiracy theorists now, I was talking to Mish about this. Now the conspiracy theorists are like, aliens aren't real. The government is lying to us to distract us from what they're really doing. So we've come full circle in the spectrum of conspiracy theorizing. And partially at fault for that, I think, is this guy, Mr. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. Public enemy number one, if you are a stacker of silver, the shiny, my favorite of the shinies, like this right here. Well, Jamie Dimon is at the helm of the bank that is largely responsible for suppressing the price of gold and silver. Now, right now, in the context of the bank run, when you see Jamie Dimon, you need to think of this guy. Now, I know we got kind of a younger audience here, but anybody remember who this guy is? This is Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah, you remember It's a Wonderful Life? Anybody? How's my Jimmy Stewart? Is it any good? Well, Mr. Potter was the banker who called up during the scene in the bank run, and he says, "Oh, don't worry. I've got your back. I'm going to support all the banks. Tell your people I'll buy their shares for 50 cents on the dollar." And of course, that sent Jimmy Stewart into a tirade because the banker was pretending to be generous. He was pretending to rescue all the little savings and loan guys. "I got your back. Oh, by the way, I'm going to buy up all your assets for 50 cents on the dollar." That is exactly what Jamie Dimon has been doing ever since Silicon Valley Bank failed. He's been painting himself as like this financial lifeguard or this financial first aid firefighter, first responder, whatever. Oh, he goes into a phone booth and he changes and he's got a big S underneath and he's swooping into the rescue to save the little banks from collapse, to shore up deposits so the poor people don't lose money. No, Jamie Dimon has been getting obscenely wealthy doing this. JP Morgan has been getting even bigger as all these banks fail, and we're going to show you how that happened today. So when you see Mr. Jamie Dimon, when you hear him talk, hear people describe him as the savior of the financial system, he's this guy. Also keep in mind this guy and why this is such a big problem. I know my European folks out there recognize this guy. This is Nigel Farage, right? He's the chief engineer of the Brexit movement. Now, set aside your personal feelings about Brexit. It's a controversial subject. I get it. But recently, Nigel Farage got a letter from his bank that said, we don't like your politics, something to the tune of, your views are not in alignment with ours, WEF, unicorns and rainbows. We don't like your ideas, Nigel Farage. So you can't bank with us anymore. You have 2 weeks to find a new bank. And so Nigel Farage said, well, up yours, I'll go find a new bank. And every bank in England that he spoke to would deny him an account. He was basically excommunicado from the financial system because they didn't like his politics. Think about that. They'll do it to him. They can do it to anybody. They don't like your politics. They kick you out of the financial system. Remember the truckers in Canada? Remember that? Remember Operation Choke Point? Don't think that won't happen in the Western Hemisphere or even in the United States. All right, so as JP Morgan is becoming bigger and bigger, as the banks continue to consolidate, as more and more banks go out of business and are gobbled up by the few bigger ones, issues like this become much more important, because try paying your mortgage without a bank account. All right. And, some people, I'm sure we'll see it in the comments. Some people will be like, I've been debt free for years. I live 100% off the grid. I have batteries and solar panels. And congratulations if you have achieved that degree of independence. That's not within reach for most people. Most people are hopelessly dependent on the financial system. You can't pay your rent. You can't pay your water, your sewer, your electric, anything without a bank account. And they kicked him out of the banking system and were not letting him back in. They were going to destroy him. Now, thankfully, NatWest came to its senses. They fired their CEO and everybody involved, not because they felt like they did wrong, but because they got called out for it and because there was public outrage, justifiably so. But they knew what they were doing. And also keep in mind, while that's happening, this ridiculous story that's going on, this is Sam Altman. Did you guys catch the video I did about WorldCoin? That ridiculous eyeball scanning altcoin? Do you think if they'll boot Nigel Farage out of the system, that the guy who's giving us ChatGPT, the AI that is supposedly going to take over the world, also wants to scan your eye and give you universal basic income and have your biometric data in his system, and thus the ability to lock you out of the financial system? Now, this altcoin is a joke. It's going to fail spectacularly and deservingly so. And when it does fail, I will shine a great big light on its failure as a warning to anybody who gets the same stupid idea next time. But understand what they want to do. They want absolute control over your life, up to and including your biometric data, they will tie it to your financial health, and it gives them the ability to excommunicate you from the civilized world. And I use that word civilized lightly. It is the 2020s. So keep all these things in mind as we're going through what's happening in the financial system. First of all, this was this week on July 26th. Go ahead, Mish.
I just want to add something to that. I don't think people understand how much the phone security, not the phone itself, but the security of the phone is used in their daily life. How many times do you have to get a text to put the code in, right? Yeah. Are you calling from the right phone? Your phone now is completely tied to your life.
Yeah. And a lot of them are already scanning your face, right? I mean, they're already using your biometric data. So, I mean, it's not that far-fetched. And we've already seen what the phone companies, Apple will boot anybody they don't like from the App Store and deny them access to their system. So, I mean, these companies, they're all World Economic Forum types.
Yeah, they all sell your data, so it doesn't really matter.
Yep.
One person complaining about the other person selling data. A person's data is under $1 a person on the black web. So,
yep. Oh, scary times, folks. But JP Morgan to buy almost $2 billion worth of mortgages in the PacWest deal, a source says. PacWest Bank, if you guys didn't catch this story this week, PacWest was one of the small regional banks that was rumored to be the next one to fail. Now, they borrowed a ton of money from some of these sources of funding that we're going to talk about today, ways that the banking system is propping itself up with debt right now. That expensive funding was driving PacWest out of business, just like Bank of California, who merged with PacWest. They were also being driven out of business because they've had to borrow such expensive money in order to offset their bond losses. Well, this deal comes along, and the two banks are going to merge, but the combined merged bank is going to be much smaller than either of the two banks already are. Why? Because JP Morgan is going to come in and buy billions of dollars worth of the mortgages, and they also get this $400 million private equity investment. JP Morgan Chase will buy almost $2 billion worth of mortgages to facilitate Banc of California's purchase of PacWest Bancorp. A source with knowledge of the matter told Reuters, there's more anonymous sources. The investment bank has entered into an agreement to buy $1.8 billion of single-family residential loans at a discount. Banc of California and PacWest on Tuesday announced an all-stock merger with a $400 million equity raising from Warburg Pincus and Centerbridge Partners to create a bank with $36 billion in assets. So JP Morgan just got almost $2 billion bigger, and they got it at a discount. They're not paying $1.8 billion for those mortgages. They're getting them at a discount. So JPM gets bigger. PacWest, a little bank, was driven out of business by the Federal Reserve and their rate hikes. And JP Morgan is saying, it's okay, we'll rescue you, just like Mr. Potter and It's a Wonderful Life, but you're going to have to give us a discount when we buy your assets. Now, JP Morgan can afford it, so they're just going to sit on those assets in their held-to-maturity column and collect the cash flow from people paying their mortgages. I just want to say thank you very much to Mr. Brian Zarb, who just jumped in with a super chat. What's going on, Brian? Check out the technicalchartist.com, by the way. That's Brian's website. He does an excellent job over there. He's one of the best technical chartists I've ever seen. And Brian is saying electrical outages have been horrible here. And here being Malta, Brian's from overseas. He says apparently the grid couldn't handle the load in the summer, 46 degrees. That's 110 Fahrenheit. Thank you for the English conversion for those who don't habla metric system. Thank you, Brian. 110 degrees, yikes, in Malta. And the grid couldn't take it. Just imagine with the EVs on the grid. You know, we're going to talk about EVs a little bit, time permitting today, Brian. But yeah, you're right. The power grid can't even keep the lights on now when all the cars are on gasoline engines. What happens if all that load of these cars goes on the grid? Even if you can solve the problem of how long it takes to charge them and the problem of the fires, there's a boat full of EVs burning right now, and the problem with the range on these vehicles, even if you solve all those big engineering challenges, you still have a power grid that can't support electric vehicles. So sorry you lost power outage there. Sorry you lost power, Brian. Stay cool, brother, and hang in there, man. If you got a basement, hang out in the basement. It's a couple degrees cooler down there. That's what I did for a while when my AC went out this week and my transfer switch broke. But we got it fixed. Good news, Dad. The Jenny's working.
So, Kelly Slade, to answer your question, that's what a Prius does. That charges us while you drive and then uses the battery off the gas. So it actually is a gas motor. It just makes it to where you get like 70 miles to the gallon. But what I was going to say is Toyota came out a couple weeks ago with a battery, which they think is a battery enhancement, which is almost instantaneous charging. I don't understand the physics behind that because it doesn't make sense.
Yep.
Physically that I know of. But then we also have that superconductor news coming out from a couple days ago, and people are already starting to recreate it right now or trying. So possibly by the end of the year, we're going to have two huge news stories on EVs.
Doomberg just came out with a piece on their Substack about the superconductor breakthrough. If true, it would be groundbreaking. Basically, the perfect conductor of electricity, something that allows you to move huge amounts of power without generating heat, which right now that does not exist. That's like the perpetual motion / cold fusion, you know, what's the word I'm trying to, the holy grail, if you will. Mm-hmm. Some researchers, was it in South Korea, I think, have claimed that they've made that breakthrough. I'm skeptical. I'm a skeptic. So sue me, tinfoil hat. I get it. Yeah, you get it. I'd love it if it were true, just like the Toyota batteries. Much remains to be seen, though. You know, as always, execution is big. But thank you very much, Mr. Zarb. Hang in there, brother, with the power outages. The same goes for all you guys who are under the heat dome in Texas and the Midwest right now. Everybody's roasting. And keep in mind, guys, the grid is hanging by a thread right now. All these ACs that are keeping grandma alive, right, or sick people alive. If the grid goes down in a heat wave like this, it's not pretty. And right now, if everybody were to plug in electric cars, the grid would fail like that. It would all go down. It would just a cascade of failures. The grid cannot handle it. All right, so we talked about JP Morgan got bigger this week, another $2 billion gobbled up. But it's not even the first time in the last few months that this happened. You guys remember JP Morgan and the bailout of First Republic Bank? Well, once again, JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon, they acted like they were Superman coming into the rescue. No, they were getting rich off of it. JP Morgan's First Republic buy is eerily similar to its 2008 Bear Stearns purchase. This was back in May. This is in Investopedia. JP Morgan's deal for First Republic Bank is reminiscent of the deal the banking giant negotiated to acquire Bear Stearns as the 2008 financial crisis unfolded. Once again, when banks fail, big banks get bigger. The whole takeaway of the GFC was supposed to be don't let the banks get too big to fail. And we have perverted that lesson into the opposite, where the big banks are getting even bigger. And that has continued ever since 2008. But look at some of the details of the First Republic buyout. JP Morgan won the auction to acquire First Republic after the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation seized control of the troubled regional bank in a deal that was finalized over a weekend, middle of the night negotiations. Other than control of the assets, the deal included loss sharing agreements with the FDIC that cover 80% of losses on single family mortgages for 7 years and 80% of losses on commercial loans, including commercial real estate, for 5 years. So JP Morgan came in when First Republic went under. They came in and they bought up billions and billions of dollars worth of loans at a discount. So right away they were profitable. On top of the discount that they got, the federal government, with your money, gave them free insurance on that loans, where if the people didn't pay those loans back, the taxpayers, you, would eat 80% of the losses on JPM's books. It was a free-for-all. They pigged out at our expense. Oh, and it gets better. Let me do a little Control F50 here, because the FDIC also provided JP Morgan with a $50 billion 5-year fixed-term financing for the deal. So JP Morgan didn't even have to hand over the money. The federal government loaned them the money, your money, for them to buy First Republic's assets at a discount, at a generous fixed-term interest rate, while at a time when interest rates are rising, and then guaranteed against 80% of any potential losses. And Jamie Dimon was on TV talking about how he wanted to save people, how he was the reluctant hero, right? Where is he? No, that's not Nigel. Oh, yeah, he was the reluctant hero. Oh, if I must save First Republic, I guess I'll save First Republic and become an even more obscenely wealthy. And by the way, that was reflected right away in JP Morgan's earnings. JP Morgan's earnings were incredible, buoyed by all the assets they bought on the cheap from First Republic at no risk to themselves, because you, the taxpayer, bore all the risk and lent JPM the money to do it. So that is how JP Morgan is getting bigger in this environment. Now let's talk about something else that I've seen, and this has really perplexed me for the last 2 months. I've been trying to figure this out. I think I may have an idea of it, and George Gammon gave me the idea today. George did a live stream talking about some of these funding programs, and I think something clicked there. I'm not 100% sure this is what's going on, but I think it is. This is M2 Money Supply, or M2SL. This is all the money in circulation in checking accounts and savings accounts, all right? Now, this is going back to about January of 2020. Here is the massive expansion of the money supply with the Federal Reserve and all their money printing and all the loans that were issued during the pandemic. We went from about $15.5 trillion in the money supply to about $21.7 trillion in under 2 years. It's the most grotesque monetary expansion in history. Now, starting in about April of last year, just after the Fed began their interest rate tightening, raising rates, March of 2022 was the first rate hike. After that, the money supply started shrinking, and it started shrinking faster. And then it started shrinking really fast in the beginning of this year, ultimately culminating with the bank failures at Silicon Valley, Signature, First Republic, Credit Suisse, PacWest, Silvergate, all the banks that went down. But then something happened in April. Or I should say it stopped in April. It started in May. The money supply started growing again. Look at these last 2 data points. What gives here? All of a sudden, there's more money in circulation after these last 2 months. Not a lot. We went from 20.7 trillion in circulation to 20.88, 20.89. It's about 180, 190 billion dollars was loaned into existence in the last 2 months. Where is it coming from? Now, it's not coming directly from the Federal Reserve, at least. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, okay? Now, we did have this big jump in the Federal Reserve's balance sheet in March, but that's not the time period we're talking about where the money supply expanded. The money supply expanded in May and June, and even since the expansion in the Fed's balance sheet in March, it's resumed its fall, and it's now lower than it was before the banking crisis started. So the Fed has been destroying money. The Fed has not, at least directly, not been buying assets. It's not coming from the Fed's balance sheet. And then we've also got this. This is bank credit, commercial credit, all banks. This is all of the loans being given in our banking system. Once again, you can see in 2020 the big expansion of loans, right? And that ultimately peaked right around February of this year is when banks started going on defense, right? Just before the bank run is when the banks stopped lending. That makes sense. When there's a bank run going on, banks go on defense, they stop making loans. So ever since then, we've seen credit has been contracting. We've been talking about the credit crunch, about how banks are not lending. A lot of people getting rejected for things like auto loans, right? So commercial credit, even through May and June, commercial credit was in decline. So banks are not giving more loans. So where is this money coming from? If the Fed isn't printing it, and if the banks aren't giving loans to consumers and aren't giving loans to borrowers and companies, where is all this debt coming from? And you can kind of see it again here. This is commercial credit for all banks in this chart. Now, this is the year-over-year change in commercial credit. And you can see here in the second quarter, below zero, it was negative. That's a credit crunch. Banks are making less loans. So it's definitely not banks making loans to us that are creating all this credit. And before I resume on this subject, I got to say a few more thank yous before they pile up. Mr. J.J. Watt, thank you, sir. He says, Mr. Melonhead, your Janet Yellen impression is spot on, and our banks are strong and resilient. Thank you very much, J.J. Watt, for complimenting my Yellen. Go figure, a 6'1", 240-pound dude can do a good impression of this 4-foot-nothing little munchkin female that runs the banking system. But yeah, whatever. I guess I do little old ladies well. I don't know what to tell you. Can you do a Stephen Van Meter for the crowd? Stephen Van Meter.
I'm not sure
I love
can
Stephen.
do Stephen Van Meter.
First, to do Stephen Van Meter, I'd have to practice it. First, we'd have to ditch the hat. I'd need a Sharpie. I'd have to make the eyebrows a lot bigger. Stephen, I love you. I love your channel. I watch you every day, by the way. I would need a fuzzy green screen, the Great Wall of China behind me. And then I would have to repeat my thumbnail in the first few seconds of every video. Stephen Van Meter's videos always start with that. It's the golden rule of YouTube, is reinforce your thumbnail in the first 30 seconds of your video. This is terrifying. This is the end. This economy is collapsing. I don't know. I can't get his tone right. Stephen's got kind of a generic voice. I'm not knocking him here. He's just, Janet Yellen has a very particular voice, so it's pretty
No,
easy.
he subscribes to the William Shatner line of acting.
The William Shatner. Go ahead, Mish. Now you're on the hook for Van Meter.
What is it? Everything's going to fall apart.
There's something on the wing.
There's something on the wing. The JP Morgan is failing rapidly. I don't know. I can't do it. I got to watch him more.
Anyways, guys, I love Steven's channel. Sorry, my Van Meter was a little lackluster. All right. I'm sorry, but maybe it would help if I had the fuzzy green screen. I don't know. But check out Stephen Van Meter's channel while you're at it. He is one of the great ones out there, and I watch him every day. I always learn something watching Stephen. He is a good one. Thank you, JJ Watt. I appreciate the super chat, the support of the channel. And thank you, Mike Kaufman, for your super chat, sir. It says, off topic, but how does Germany, with the loss of their energy, affect global markets? Pretty big player looks screwed. You know, I did a lot of commentary last fall about Germany and their energy situation, and none of it came to fruition. Europe dodged a bullet last winter. We had a warmer than expected winter, and U.S. LNG was able to make up the shortfall, and to a certain extent, Middle Eastern LNG was able to make up the shortfall in European energy demand that would have otherwise come from the Russian gas shipments. It would be silly and it would be dangerous to assume that will be the case again this winter. If we have a severe winter, I don't know that U.S. LNG would be enough to be able to keep Europe out of that. Also, Europe shut down a lot of its industry. Right? The German economy just entered a recession recently, an official recession. They're not trying to define their way out of it. They're admitting they're in one. That's one of the reasons why the European Central Bank may be done with their rate hike cycle. So it's going to affect global markets. It's also going to add to shortages because Germany is a global powerhouse in manufacturing. So you're going to have a shortage of certain manufacturing goods that could drive up prices in some areas of the economy. So it could be a little bit inflationary, at least in markets that are dependent on imports like the U.S. But I don't think we've heard the last of that European energy story. I mean, certainly the Europeans have only made things worse with their energy policy, and the arrogance. They think it's because of the windmills and the solar panels that they survived winter. It's not. And so I think that's going to get worse before it gets better. So that's my hot take on the situation in Germany. And yeah, the big players do look screwed. My hat goes out to any of you guys who work in manufacturing. My heart goes out to you, not my hat. Sorry, I'm keeping my hat. My heart goes out to you guys. I hate to see a plant closed. I've lived through it. All right, my wife and I both worked at a nuclear power plant, and when that plant closed, 650 people all lost their job on the same day. That's how you devastate a town. It sucks. All right, and that's happening all over Germany right now. That's a very big deal. Lives are thrown into a mess. Entire towns are destroyed, and it's not just the plant that loses jobs. If you've got restaurants, hotels, hardware stores, everything around a plant, when that plant closes, all those other businesses are affected. So it's going to cause problems for the Germans, absolutely. So hang in there, Mike. Hang in there to all you guys in Germany. And hopefully better things are on the horizon and reason will prevail. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate the generosity in the super chats. Back onto the story. Where is the money expansion coming from? All right. We've established it's not credit, right? Articles like this. U.S. banking credit continues declining, increasing global fragility. This is from July 11th. This is in speculatorsAnonymous.com. The mainstream financial press is not covering the contraction in credit. They won't talk about it. They're too busy talking about Taylor Swift and the Barbie movie. They're too busy talking about this soft landing. All right. Now, to understand where the money might be coming from, first, let me just do a refresher for some of you guys who are newer here. This was a very important thing in my own financial journey, which, I don't have any formal background in finance, but understanding the relationship between bond prices and interest rates, or bond yields and bond prices, is so important to understand what's going on in the banking system. So we're going to just spend a little bit of time on this. When interest rates go up, debt prices go down. All right. And bonds are debt. So this holds true for loans. This holds true for bonds. This holds true for a lot of derivative products, for car loans, for credit card debt. All right. Banks are constantly buying and selling our debt to each other. Right. Have you ever had all of a sudden your mortgage servicer changes? That's because your bank sold your loan to another bank. Well, if interest rates went up, your bank lost money when they sold your loan, because when interest rates went up, your bond, your mortgage went down in value. And that's why the banks have such problems right now. That's why banks are failing, because interest rates were driven higher so fast by the Federal Reserve that all the banks are having weakness now, because the stuff that they bought with our money has gone down in value. And the loans that they're holding on their books, the bonds that they're holding on their books, have all gone down in value, but they still owe us the money that we put into the bank. So now a lot of banks are insolvent. The big banks can survive that, the little ones can't. Now, one of the ways that the Federal Reserve...
Can I take a shot at something here, Jack?
Yeah, go ahead, Mish.
All right, so bond prices. So let's say a bond sells for $100 and it promises it'll pay you $101. That bond is paying 1% interest. To get a higher percentage, you have to sell that bond for a lower price. So then if you sell it for $95, you're getting $6 at maturity, and you're getting 6% interest, right? And it goes the other way too. But so what you do is people buy it at 100 and are selling it for 95 now. They're losing that $5, that 5% of the price. And that's what's happening.
Yeah. So again, the key thing there, the prices and the interest rates are inversely correlated. And always picture this seesaw. If you see the bond price go up, that's the interest rate going down. This is how QE works when the Fed does quantitative easing, right? When the Fed does quantitative easing, they do the reverse of this picture. They buy a whole bunch of bonds, driving the price of the bond higher. That drives the interest rate lower. That's what they did during the pandemic. Right now, the Fed is a net seller of bonds. That's driving the price of the bonds lower, driving the interest rates higher. All right, so where is this money coming from? Here's one of the places it's coming from. This is the Bank Term Funding Program, or the BTFP. This was the new bailout. It was announced in the middle of the night, Sunday night, right before the market opened, when everybody was worried about the bank run. I did a live stream a few minutes after this story broke that, yep, it's another bailout. They're calling it something different, but it was a bailout. All right. And that started in March in the middle of the night, and up it goes, and it's only gone up ever since. Now, what the Bank Term Funding Program is is this lets people take a bond. Remember that bond, that $100 that was borrowed in Mish's story, and they promised to pay back $101? Well, interest rates have risen, so that bond is now only worth $95. But what the Bank Term Funding Program allows the bank to do is the bank can go to the Fed and say, here is this IOU from Mish that's only worth $95, but it was worth $100 when I made the loan to Mish, and the Fed will loan me $100. I give them something worth $95, they give me $100. That's basically how the Bank Term Funding Program works. They're artificially inflating the value of the bonds that were driving the banks insolvent. So they're preventing asset prices from going lower. Now, if the banks didn't have the option to do this, if you couldn't park that loan at the Federal Reserve and get face value for it more than you could sell it for, the alternative would be to sell that asset in order to get the money that you need to pay people back. Well, if you sell that asset, what happens to the price of that asset? Selling assets drives values lower. So if all the banks were forced to sell assets at the same time in order to raise the money to meet the withdrawals from the bank run, it would have turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy, this feedback loop of prices heading lower, driving more banks insolvent, forcing them to sell more assets, forcing prices even lower, round and round we go. So this is how the Fed removed some of the dominoes by artificially inflating the prices to prevent the sale of those assets. Now, that is $105 billion that they loaned into existence. All right, so this is one of the ways I think they've expanded the money supply. Now, I can't draw you a perfect picture and say, here is the mechanism where the BTFP money shows up in people's checking accounts, and therefore it adds to the M2 money supply, which is what we're seeing rise. All right, so this is where my understanding of the banking system comes up a little short, and I want to be fully transparent with my limitations here for you guys. Again, I have no formal background in finance. My background is mechanical engineering. But long story short, what they're doing here is they're artificially inflating asset prices to stop bank runs, to prevent insolvencies, which would cause money to be destroyed. When somebody defaults, money goes up in smoke. And so this is expanding the money supply, whether directly or indirectly is up for debate, but that is the net effect of what it's doing. Now, another place they're getting money, another place the money supply might be expanding is from Federal Home Loan Banks, or FHLBs. Now, Federal Home Loan Banks are not the Fed. They are private government-sponsored enterprises. These were created after the Great Depression, when the government said, we need to create a bank for banks so that when banks get into trouble, they can access a loan from a big bank that is made up of several little banks combined, and then they'll have that money that they can continue to make loans. The idea was to make homes more affordable for people. Well, like everything federal, this has now mutated and been bastardized into this giant thing that is a pig trough for wealthy elites to pig out at. I guess I need to put the tinfoil hat back on because I'm getting conspiracy, but it's the 2020s. It's all right. Well, Federal Home Loan Banks, when they make a loan to a smaller bank, that's referred to as an advance. All right, and what we're looking at right here is FHLB advances. This is loans from Federal Home Loan Banks to other smaller banks. And this has been on the rise since the fourth quarter of 2021, big time. Currently over $1 trillion has been loaned from the Federal Home Loan Banks to the member banks. And I just want to zoom out a little bit on the chart so you can understand how significant that is. The last time FHLB advances, these Federal Home Loan Bank loans, the last time this line went vertical, well, it was right before the pandemic hit. Remember repo madness? A lot of people say that debt crisis was coming whether the disease got here or not. Tinfoil hat. Well, we had a big financial crisis a few months later. And the time before that, when FHLB advances went vertical, was 2007. You may recall that did not end well, 2007. Well, right now, FHLB advances are even higher than they were at the peak of the global financial crisis. Now, FHLBs, these are known as the lender of second to last resort for a bank. Right? If you're a bank and you're desperate for money, you can go to the FHLB. That's one way. Or you could sell assets to raise cash. That's one way. If you're really desperate, if you're really, really desperate, your last resort to borrow money is the Fed's discount window. And once again, I just want to send a shout out to the Rebel Capitalist, to George Gammon, who did a video on this today. Great video. George is a great channel, along with Stephen Van Meter. That's another one you guys should be following. George did a good video on this one today. You should check it out. The Federal Reserve's discount window. Now, this is like, if you're here borrowing, you're done. You're almost dead. All right. When a bank goes to the federal discount window, or the Federal Reserve's discount window, there's a stigma about this. All right. Like, banks are hesitant to do this because once people see them doing that, they're like, oh, this bank is going to fail. And it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a lot of banks are hesitant to go to the discount window for a loan because it usually means that bank is about to fail.
Well, that's why they put that year-long rider on the BFTP, right? So we can't see for another year.
Yes.
We're too deep and market's closed.
Okay. That was a great point, Mish, about the rider on the Bank Term Funding Program, because the Bank Term Funding Program is very similar to the Fed's discount window, but they made it anonymous. They made it so we, the bank's customers, cannot see if our bank is desperate to borrow money. Doesn't that make you feel wonderful? They won't tell us if our banks are in trouble. Don't you think we deserve to know that? Now, I get why they don't want to tell us that, right? It's like if the theater is on fire, you might cause a stampede if you yell fire, but the theater is on fire and there's people in it. So don't you think the people in the theater deserve to know that? Something to think about. Well, the BTFP is basically the Fed's discount window with anonymity attached. But there's also lending at the Fed's discount window that's happening to the tune of $260 billion. And that's only as of the end of the first quarter. That's the most recent data that we have. So we don't know how much borrowing happened at the discount window after the end of March when First Republic failed and everything else. For all we know, this has gone up, or for all we know, it's gone down. Now, I suspect it may be starting to go down because one of the things that PacWest announced when they merged with Bank of California is they're taking that money from JP Morgan, the $1.8 billion in assets that JPM's buying, and they're taking that $400 million from the private equity, and they're using that money they said, to pay down expensive borrowings. Now, the one thing all three of these programs have in common, the Fed's discount window, Federal Home Loan Bank advances, and the Bank Term Funding Program, these are all expensive debts. All right. If you go to these places to borrow money, if you're a bank, you are paying out the wazoo for this money, probably about 5%. Compare that to JP Morgan, who only pays, what, 0.5% interest on their checking and their savings account. So the big banks can access cheap money easily. But the little guys, in order to survive, in order to not be gobbled up by JP Morgan, are having to borrow this expensive money from the Bank Term Funding Program, from the FHLBs, and from the Fed's discount window. Now, besides causing this is my opinion here, that these programs are what's causing this blip in the money supply right now, it's going to be short-lived because these little banks cannot keep this up for very long. The debt is too expensive, and their earnings are going to be taking hits by that. And if they report lousy earnings from these expensive borrowings, then their days are numbered because their stocks are going to crash, and when people see their bank stocks going down, they go take their money out of the bank. And that's why PacWest and Bank of California announced that deal where JPM bought all this stuff the day before they reported earnings, because they knew they probably weren't going to survive their earnings calls. So JPM just gobbled them up and got bigger. And I think it's the Feds, the Federal Home Loan Bank, that is where this blow up in the money supply is happening. And it's all designed, tinfoil hat time, it's all designed to drive consolidation in the banking system so the big guys get bigger, so that this guy has more power, and we end up with stories like this nonsense and this nonsense. Nigel Farage being booted out of the banking system. It's much easier for a small gaggle of they to force their views and their way of thinking on the world if they control everything. Right now, they're on their way to controlling everything. All right, I am a few deep in the super chats that I have to say thank you to. Let's see, who do we have here? Mr. Edward Diaz is pushing my buttons with the Barbie movie. Nicely done, Edward. He says, hey, the Barbie movie is an American staple defining our current time. Oh, wait. I have not seen the Barbie movie. But might I recommend you go on YouTube and watch some of the criticisms of the Barbie movie? That makes for some very entertaining viewership. The plot of the Barbie movie is, well, about what you'd expect. About what you'd expect if the World Economic Forum and Disney and, I don't know, Janine Garofalo got together and decided to come up with a script. You'd get the Barbie movie. That's what you'd end up with.
It's very formulaic of a movie from what I hear. I have some people within my small group that went and saw it. It was not a pleasant movie for them.
Unpleasant. And look, guys, at risk of sounding shallow, I'm digging me some Margot Robbie. All right, I've seen The Wolf of Wall Street. I have seen The Big Short. It's one of the best lessons in the world. If you want to know how, CDOs work, here's Margot Robbie in a bathtub. I can't compete with that. I mean, I'll teach you guys, but I can't do Margot Robbie in a bathtub, and I don't think you want to see me try.
Suicide Squad.
Suicide Squad, very good movie. Underrated movie, Suicide Squad. I thought it was pretty good. And the sequel as well. But thank you very much, Edward Diaz, an American staple defining our current time. Yeah, that's true, and no, that does not reflect well on us, does it? Thanks a lot, Edward. I appreciate it. And Peter Frowen. What's going on, Peter? Made it all the way to Crimea. Keep your head down, brother. Be safe. Sending love from Crimea. Thanks, Jack. Thank you, Peter. I hope you are well, brother. I hope you stay safe in your travels. And, well, hang in there, brother. That's all I can say. I'm going to get myself in trouble if I talk too much on that subject. Yeah, again, the hat and everything. All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the generosity very much. And I just want to mention the markets are closed, as Mish said. So the S&P ended up holding the line pretty much into close, right where it's been traded most of the day, 45.80, up 43 points, just off its highs for the week. The Dow ended up 176 points, or 0.5%, 35,459. And the NASDAQ had a heck of a day, up 266 points. On what? On Intel's earnings. 1.9% for the whole index because Intel laid off enough people to make everybody forget about the fact that their sales were down 15% year over year, and the whole index adds another 1.9%. Sure, why not? Now, while we're on the subject of Intel earnings, and sure, why not, let's talk about some of the more ridiculous things going on. First of all, while we were talking about what's going on in the banks, let me just mention this article here. Kevin O'Leary's warning. Forgive the name here. We're going to gloss over Kevin O'Leary, the FTX guy, but the message of this article rings true here. Warning rings true as a worsening credit crunch crushes America's small business. All right. Now, remember, as the money supply has slowly expanded for the last 2 months, it's down year over year, but it's up for the last 2 months. All of these lendings from the banks, all driving the little banks into the clutches of the big banks. While that's all going on, there is no money available for small businesses. And that is the gist of this article in Market Insider. America's small businesses are getting crushed by a credit squeeze. Borrowing costs for such companies have surged to unprecedented levels, 60% higher relative to those for larger corporates with moderate credit risk, thanks to the Federal Reserve's interest rate increases and a tightening of lending standards following this year's banking turmoil. Jeff Weniger, head of equity strategy at financial services firm WisdomTree, highlighted an unprecedented gap between the cost of credit for small firms, mom and pops, small businesses, and the rest of the corporate sector. This is the widest gap on record. The NFIB Small Business Survey's 9.2% cost for short-term loans is several percent higher than the 5.75% yield on Moody's seasoned BAA corporate bonds. So what they're saying here is the average small business loan right now, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, or Foundation, I don't know what the F stands for exactly, but the average cost of a small business loan, 9.2%. But the big guys, the big corporates, they can still get to the bond market where their bonds are only yielding 5.75%. So the big companies can get cheaper money than the little companies. And that is the biggest on record since the previous record was set in 2006. Oh, I'm sorry. This is even bigger than the gap in 2006. Oh, great. Costs more for the small business to borrow than the big business. It costs 60% more And that gap has never been so high. So again, everything that's going on in the banking system, everything that the Fed is doing, everything that Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan is doing, they are crushing the small competition to the benefit of the bigger competition. And once again, I have to remind you of this story. They, with a capital T, have created conditions where the little cannot survive, but the big can. And they're going to keep them here as long, see also higher for longer, they're going to keep them here as long as they can to make sure enough of the little guys go out of business that only the big guys survive. Now, forget for a minute that this article is talking about Kevin O'Leary. This is absolutely happening in markets right now, and it shows. Big bankruptcies rise at the fastest pace this year. Chapter 11 filings of businesses with at least $100 million in debt or assets or of national prominence totaled at least 82 through June. That's up from 29 a year earlier. First 6 months of this year, there was 82 big bankruptcies in the U.S. There was only 29 last year. These higher interest rates are killing companies. It hasn't shown up in unemployment yet, but it's coming. Unless these bankruptcies suddenly stop, and I have no reason to expect that they're going to stop, especially now that credit is not available. And coincidentally, while all this is happening, shout out to you millennials and you Gen Zers out there, it's getting even harder to afford a starter home in the U.S. First-time home buyers need to earn at least $64,500 a year to afford the average entry-level house, according to a new report. Guys, not long ago, somebody making $64,500 a year would be viewed as upper middle class. Maybe not obscenely wealthy, but somebody who's comfortable living a pretty healthy lifestyle. That was enough money to live in a nice place in a nice neighborhood. Now, that is the minimum that you need to afford this beat-up, dump, entry-level house. And this is why I get so mad when I see what the Fed is doing, when I see what the big banks are doing, because who is paying for this most? Right now, it's kids. And by say kids, I mean young adults, people who just want to get their lives started. They spent their whole life in academia, going into debt, student loan debt, being told, just get the degree, you'll be fine. Now they're out, they're up to their eyeballs in debt. Maybe they got a job. Job market's still pretty good, but it doesn't matter. They can't afford the house. They've been lied to their whole lives. Meanwhile, we have conditions in the market right now where if the government just stops with the bailouts, if they just stop and they let the market correct to where it wants to go, these home prices will come down. All right, now I recognize this is contrary to my own personal interests right now because my home is worth a whole heck of a lot more than I paid for it right now. But the flip side to that coin is some kid that just got out of college. He wants to get married and start having kids. He's stuck in a lousy apartment. He can't buy a house to start a family in because he can't afford it because of this everything bubble that has been created by the Federal Reserve. This nonsense has got to stop. Entire generations are being robbed of the American dream, all so this jabroni can make his big bank even bigger. And no, I don't say jabroni often. I just don't want to use profanity and get myself in trouble. All right, guys. I think we've been going long enough here. Let's doff the tinfoil hat for the moment. What do you think, Mish? Am I off base here? Is this where the money supply growth is coming from? Is it these new loan programs that the Fed has created?
I think a lot of it is, we had a long discussion about was it reserve repo or not, reverse repo, sorry. I think that money is already counted in the system. The new BFTP loaning is not.
Correct.
Right. So I think that, that's kind of where my thinking is.
A lot of the reverse repo money started out as bank deposits, as money in CDs, money in checking, money in money markets. And then those funds put the money into the reverse repo. Now that short-term interest rates have risen and now that the debt ceiling is behind us, those funds say, okay, it's safe to put that money into short-term treasuries. So I could be wrong about this, but I don't think it's reverse repo that's causing this money supply growth. That is a solid theory, though. But you also keep in mind, let me bring that chart back up real quick. That is a solid theory, and it shows that the melon heads are ahead of the curve. But the one thing I would challenge on the fact that it might be reverse repo is if you look at the money supply growth, it started after April. So really it started in May. And we didn't see the reverse repo start to come down until June.
Until the end of May.
Till the end of May. Yep. The reverse repo started falling pretty much right at the beginning of June, and it fell through June and into July. Now, the other reason I don't think it would be reverse repo is because the money supply growth slowed in June. It didn't accelerate in June, right? We had a bigger move up. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little clearer. We had a bigger move up from April to May than we had from May to June. If reverse repo was in play, we would have seen a bigger move from May to June than we saw from April to May. So that is a good thought, and that is certainly, reverse repos is money that was on Mars, and now it's being lent or spent into the economy. But I don't think reverse repo is necessarily the mechanism of this money supply growth. Not that it couldn't, because right now a lot of the reverse repo cash has been sent to short-term treasuries, so it's gone from sitting on Mars to sitting in the government's checking account, the Treasury General account. Now, eventually, Janet Yellen is going to spend that money into the economy, and it will filter in and eventually end up in checking accounts and money markets. So it could eventually result in M2 growth, but it hasn't happened yet. Thank you very much, though. That was good input. And I got one more just came in from Mr. Diaz. Is Klaus a jabroni? Say yes and why. Klaus, no, he's not a jabroni. Klaus is a nice guy. I especially love all the things he does for the young people. He uses the young people to penetrate the cabinets so you will eat the bugs. Is Klaus a jabroni? No, Klaus is not jabroni. Klaus is King Jabroni, all right? Or Emperor Jabroni, if you will. Klaus is the jabroni that rules all others. One jabroni to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. That is Klaus, all right? He is not just your ordinary run-of-the-mill bottom shelf jabroni, all right? He is the tippy top of the pyramid. If there's anybody pulling Klaus Schwab's strings, they're good, all right? If you can be that powerful where a guy like Klaus is at your behest and somehow you're able to keep your name and yourself out of the public purview, then you are hideously, grotesquely powerful. So I think Klaus is probably King Jabroni, not just your average run-of-the-mill. Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz. I appreciate the super chat, sir, the support of the channel. And thank you, 1-2, or is that a 12? I don't know. Thank you. Or maybe 1/2. Thank you, 1-2, you numerical SOBU. He says, do you know Kate Tuomi from Oyster Creek? Interesting. No, I don't. That name doesn't ring a bell, but you guessed right. Oyster Creek was the nuclear plant that I used to work at. I worked there from 2007 to 2018. I'm not sure if Miss Tuomi, how do you say that? No, that name doesn't ring a bell, but small world. Somebody is watching my channel who knows somebody from Oyster Creek. That's interesting. The Oyster Creek Nuclear Generating Station was a BWR Mark II nuclear reactor that I used to work at in Forked River, New Jersey. I actually grew up fishing in the discharge canal there. You could catch stripers all year long in that discharge canal, and they were totally healthy. That plant shut down in 2018. It had been scheduled to operate all the way up until 2040. I would still be there had it not been for Jon Corzine. You may remember Jon Corzine, the former governor of New Jersey, also the former CEO of IMF Global, the hedge fund that, oh, whoops, we lost a few $1 billion. Don't know where it went. It's got to be around here somewhere. Sorry about that. Never did a day of jail time for it. Just misplaced a few billion. True story. Look it up. Well, on Jon Corzine's very last day in office, and I do mean his last day, he had a gal named Lisa Jackson, who was the head of the Department of Environmental Protection in New Jersey, issue a requirement for the Oyster Creek Nuclear Generating Station to build cooling towers. Those giant Simpsons hourglass-shaped structures, those are cooling towers. Oyster Creek had a once-through cooling system. We would take water from Barnegat Bay. We would use it to cool the condensers and then discharge warm water back into the bay. Well, a cooling tower would not add that heat to the bay. Now, that heat was actually a benefit to the bay. Nobody ever talked about that when the environmentalists were protesting everything every day. Well, on Jon Corzine's last day in office, Lisa Jackson orders Oyster Creek to build these $800 million cooling towers, which of course would have cost more than the plant was worth. So as a political middle finger to clean and safe nuclear energy, on Jon Corzine's last day in office, he ended my nuclear career, or ended my career at Oyster Creek. Now, when Chris Christie came in behind him and became the governor of New Jersey, Oyster Creek negotiated a deal with Chris Christie. With the stroke of a pen, Chris Christie could have undone that, but chose not to. Instead, he cut a deal that the plant would close in 2020 instead of 2040. And then, of course, when power prices dropped and the plant only had 2 years left in its life expectancy, we were only one mechanical failure away from the end of plant life. And that ended up coming in about 2018. So, my life, my whole family's life, because my wife and I both worked there, along with 640 some odd other people. We all worked there at the same time. And politicians just screwing around with the stroke of a pen, hundreds of lives disrupted. Just as an FU on their last day in office, let me destroy a few hundred lives. Not to mention take $90 million a year out of the local economy. So I'm not bitter. I'm so bitter about that.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, no, I'm not bitter.
Between BWRs in the military and civilians?
A BWR stands for boiling water reactor, where there's actually steam bubbles.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the Navy and civilian BWRs? The major difference between the two, or the nucleic boiling?
Nuclear boiling? You don't get any boiling inside a Navy reactor, right?
No.
Yeah. You're not supposed to get any boiling inside a PWR either. I didn't work on a PWR. I worked on a BWR, but I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to have any bubbles inside a PWR. Could be wrong about that. I never worked at a
It
P.
depends on the site. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into that.
Well, yeah, you're getting a little sideshow in nuclear physics here, folks. Sorry. But no, I do not know Miss. I can't even pronounce the name right, Miss Tuomi from Oyster Creek, but I did spend a couple of years at the Creek. It was a good time. Thank you, 12. Thank you, everybody, for the super chats and for the support of the channel. Guys, appreciate everything, all your time, all the super chats, all the support. I appreciate you, all of my Patreon supporters, for everything you guys do for the channel. Link down below, should you feel so inclined. Miss, you got anything you want to add before we roll?
Did you get Dan's nuclear popcorn?
Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, stop the tunes. Stop the tunes, Dan. With this nuclear talk, I have to say go uranium. Okay. I'm not particularly, I don't invest that much in uranium, or at all for that matter.
The
Let me tell you why.
Talk about uranium all of a sudden is yesterday Manchin got an addendum to the NDAA to talk about solidifying our uranium supply lines.
So does that probably looking at funding for domestic production of uranium is in the horizon? Okay, that's good. That's smart. We should have a domestic supply of uranium. Look, the Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia that is just now nearing completion is $16 billion over budget. All right, when that plant was announced, it was supposed to cost $5 billion per reactor, and now they're $16 billion over budget on 2 reactors. Nuclear has a startup cost problem that the industry needs to solve. And unfortunately, the regulators have only made that worse since the Vogtle problem started. And that's why I'm not among the uranium bulls because of that problem. I'm not saying uranium prices can't go higher or won't go higher. I'm just saying commercial nuclear power as it stands in the United States, because of the regulatory environment, the hoops that they have to jump through. See also Oyster Creek being forced to build cooling towers. The stupidity of that is unbelievable. I just don't see a bull case for uranium because of that. Maybe I'm jilted by my experience in the industry. I don't know. Possible. Entirely possible. But I am happy to see that our legislators are taking that seriously. And thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate that. And I'm going to throw the tunes back up again. Mish, you used your dime for Dan. Guys, tough times coming, but they're not here yet. Enjoy this weekend. Spend some time with your loved ones. Thank you, everybody, for everything you did. Also, hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. And don't forget that like button and that subscribe button while you're here. We do this every Friday. Won't you please join us next week? And until next time, live small and dream big.